Hey everyone, welcome to another video of mine. Today going to be going over a presentation that I gave at FARCon 2017. For those of you that are not familiar with FARCon, it stands for Financial Services and Retail Conference. It's a conference that is typically held in August in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I have been fortunate enough to be attending since its inception a few years ago. I typically present their uh, presentations that tend to be very operational focused. That tends to be what the crowd likes, something that they can go back to their office and share with the rest of the people on their team around best practices that they learned. This year, I chose a different approach. And that approach was really based off of what I've been seeing in the market in terms of success rates. Most data science teams that I've seen are running into issues of completing their projects successfully and also delivering to the business a model that works well. And by model, I mean a structure of the team that allows the business to actually recoup a lot of what they've spent on these teams. As a result, you've seen a lot of professionals out there who are sponsoring these projects talk about data science as something that does not live up to its expectations. Now, I've been fortunate in that I have had great success with a lot of the teams that I've built, and I've built teams at companies such as Best Buy, Target, C.H. Robinson, Fortune 500 companies that are facing lots of pressures. And as you see with Target and Best Buy, the efforts have paid off in that they have now turned the corner, and those some of those projects are helping them to fend off Amazon. Amazon, which tends to like hiring people that I train. So it's sort of a win-win for everybody, I guess, that I'm building these teams. But once what I've noticed also is once I leave, there's often a period where the teams go through a failure period. And also, when people ask me for advice and I'm no longer, I give them what I have and I'm not around, they tend to also have a high failure rate. And that really drew me to wonder, why is there a failure rate? And what I discovered was that a lot of the uh, principles around the work are not being discussed. Everybody just wants to get to the how instead of the why and the what. And this is what this presentation is all about. I entitled it around data governance and data strategy, mainly because I'm not really into clickbaitish type titles. So I tend to have pretty plain, boring titles. But a lot of this is a presentation around a lot of the back end processes that I've used myself for great success. So let's jump into the presentation. Uh, Starting with welcome to the dark ages of knowledge. Originally, a lot of people said I should use this as a title for the presentation, but like I said, not really into clickbaitish type titles. Uh, One of the stats that I found that was quite interesting is that a Gartner study said that 73% of executives believe big data science will revolutionize their business. And this is quite true. This is something I've seen where there's very few businesses that are not trying to get into this space or who are already not in the space. But only 8% describe their projects in this space as successful. Now, success was around a business success, such as being able to produce revenue or have a project that actually produced a profit in a reasonable amount of time. And there are a lot of things, a lot of positions out there around what makes data science successful or what are some of the obstacles. And those obstacles can be costs, dependency on legacy systems, siloed organizations, lack of strong executive sponsorship, or absence of clear business cases. And I've seen all these in play. And I've seen where these issues that do come up are also mitigated and there are still problems. So there is something that's more fundamental to the issue at hand than just these obvious core issues that we're seeing. In a lot of ways, data science today in most organizations is a one hand clap. Data science is not living up to the expectations and has a lot to do with what we look at. The current model is to view data science as part coder and part statistician. That would have been fine back in 2014 in the space, but the complexities of the work has really grown. And that means the old model of just thinking as a data scientist as a coder and statistician and rolled into one really is not good enough anymore. This model and belief is really out of date. And I've seen in recent times companies that don't acknowledge this continue to fail to deliver. Many people have recognized this and have come up with new models that continue to try and bridge the gap of data science and success. But often they're employing the wrong approach and doubling down on the existing paradigm, which leads to what I describe as the one hand clap. By saying a data scientist now is about exploring data or developing models, data mining, machine learning, artificial intelligence, neural networks, data visualization, and so on, that really doesn't get to the heart of the problem. At the end of the day, you're treating data science as a process instead of a product. Data science really is a product, and the current focus right now is on the process, not the product. Like any product, it begins with and needs an end. And most of the time, that's really not there. Because people just look at it as a process and they say, well, I did the process, it's good enough. But anybody who actually has built products and understands product development and product growth realizes that products are a lot like living things. They have a definite beginning and a definite end, but they also have phases and stages that they go through. Just like a person, they're born, they learn to walk, they learn to talk, and then they go off and they do other things. A product has pretty much a similar life too, if you're treating it properly. But most data science teams are not functioning in that way. Many organizations have started to apply data governance to help data science achieve results. Data governance has provided a lot of discipline and structure that is often needed for data science. For many teams, data governance is the traditional sense, uh, can help the team achieve goals that otherwise are out of reach. As I have seen, the traditional sense of data governance just isn't enough on its own, though. It does a great job of showing us what is needed to help the team out of trouble from a legal and regulatory perspective, but it on its own, it doesn't really get to the heart of the problem. It does a great job from the KPI perspective about pointing out the inefficiencies of many data science teams. I've often seen some of these teams are spending 40 to 60% of their budget on data cleansing, which a lot of these teams they have six-figure salaries as the norm. So you're spending millions of dollars that you're just flushing down the toilet on data cleansing when you could have a better process of data governance in place to minimize those costs. So that's great, and that does help get you to a certain level of uh, improvement. But in a lot of cases, that still doesn't take the company all the way to solving their issue as to why their data science projects are failing on such a massive scale. As I stated before, traditional data governance is just not enough. To look at the problem, I realize that most teams are forgetting the very fundamental part of the puzzle that needs to be addressed, and that is human behavior and the principles by which we interact. Why our methods are not helping us achieve results is because we are not looking at the situation accurately. Our society has changed over the past 20 years, but for the most part, we're not taking into account how people have changed socially. And that brings us to a point where we have to recognize the fact that we all change. So, processes that are looking at how we've done things in the past just don't apply anymore. And we also believe that just because we have a new process in place, that must means it's good, even though we don't always test that out. For the most part, we're dealing with digital as the past. And the new wave is really about solving stupidity, not from a human perspective, but really from a technology perspective. We are using algorithms left and right without truly understanding them, and without really applying them in a way that makes a lot of sense. That's the stupidity that needs to be solved. Our computers still can't interpret information that's processed and solve those problems at the level most of us really want. And that's because we're forgetting the bedrock principle here, which is human principles. Yes, you need a business case. Yes, you need analytics. Yes, you need governance. But if you don't understand the basic human principles that drive what we do and how we interact, it really doesn't matter what you have in place in terms of a process. Odds are you are going to fail. By focusing on human principles, we are moving from just talking about data to the connection between data and the meaning of what the data is trying to tell us. This is often assumed and often assumed incorrectly because most people are never taught these things. I like to call it data strategy for lack of a better phrase. History is often called the study of humanity. Data is the study of human activity, and it is that human activity that is what is most important. Just data science alone never gets us to this level of understanding. Data governance with data science gets us to some part of this level, but can we call that a full understanding? No. Data strategy combined with data science and data governance helps us understand human activity in data. These concepts and principles are often hidden in the background, not discussed, but pushed on the teams and projects to lead to success or failure. These are the various areas that are real world drivers of success so far that I have discovered. Getting to the root allows us to have a great strategy and allows your governance of the data to be more in line with how it should be used in data science. These concepts, expert intuition, networks around people, aspect to aspect transitions, atemporality, and heterotopias are concepts that you rarely hear about in data science circles. But that's something that I believe needs to change if anybody really wants to have true success with their data science projects. Expert governance, or as I like to call it, expert intuition. Expert intuition, everyone claims to have it. Few actually do. Expert intuition is what someone has when they have worked in the field long enough to spot the patterns. Most data scientists do not have the tenure to have expert intuition. There are a few in the Twin Cities, which is where I live, who have expert intuition, and you'll notice one thing in common about all of them. They tend to have gray hair or very little hair, and that's because expert intuition is only gained in the field where someone has been at it for a long time. The other thing you'll also notice about expert intuition is that there are no expert lottery winners. And that's because high randomness of patterns is one of the things that makes it very difficult for humans to gain expertise in. So you're really looking at fields that only have high levels of patterns that can be spotted. The nice thing about most of what data scientists are looking for, at least in the customer facing world, is that humans are creatures of habits. So data analysis around human behavior is an area that someone can have expert intuition. These people should be the mentors of the team and paid well. They don't have to run the team, and something you may notice is many of them do not want to be in the management role where they're leading people. This is where I tend to put them in more of a fellowship track where they have the seniority and the respect of others, but not having to actually manage them. It's important that the level of intuition that these people have is something that can be taught to the rest of the team. If they don't have a personality that allows them to teach to others, they're not very useful at that point in time. In a lot of ways, you could think of them as grandmaster chess players teaching people that are trying to become grandmasters themselves. That's really where I find they have great skill at. But the other thing is to think about when it comes to this is a trap that I often see teams fall into. We often don't quantify our technology use. We just assume new is good. And there's very little evidence that digital accounts for most of the changes in our business. But because we hear it a lot, we tend to fall in what's called the frequency illusion. And this is very prevalent in data science, where just because we hear about something quite a bit within our own circle, we assume that it must be important and it must be good without really doing the validation that needs to take place. I've seen this over and over again with data science teams that it's really become a pitfall that I recognize that teams can fall into quite readily. And it's combined with something called the recency effect, where if it's something they hear a lot and they've heard it recently, that means it must be correct. But we shouldn't allow ourselves to get fooled by this type of thinking because a true expert will understand that patterns only come up over time, and recency and frequency are very poor indicators over something's authenticity. Moving on to networks, and by this, networks are not about the technology networks. History is how we define who we are for ages. Networks in the past were often like exclusive clubs limited by location and communication tools. We had books, and for the most part, that allowed for batch processing of data by networks. And it also allowed us to define who we called an expert. If someone was not published, odds are we never heard about them and they were not considered an expert. Yet someone who got a book published was often deemed an expert, whether or not there was any peer review or critiquing of it. Uh, because of our limitation in communications tool, it made it difficult to truly critique people. So you saw a lot of good books that were out there, but you also saw a lot of pretty bad books that gave people a leg up. That has changed. Today's networks don't respect history anymore. Truth is often defined on the fly. Data is poorly organized, but seems persuasive, even when it's really not true. And that's because in today's networks, it's the person who can be the most persuasive, not the most accurate, that can often have the most sway over the network. In the past, we also had what's called a master narrative, but today that's often lacks because logic and reason are taking a backseat to more emotional and short term thinking methods. You can blame the internet for this, particularly Google and Facebook, where in the past, deep thought was the standard method of problem solving. Today, we want quick answers. That means solutions tend to be more emotional based than thought based. Nicholas Carr, an author, has written several books on this topic. But networks, as we have them today, are here to stay. They are how we share knowledge for the most part, and they are replacing traditional networks. Most people do not understand how their own networks influence their thinking and how this is often a trap that sometimes leads to success without understanding or failure because the true understanding of success was never actually understood. The problem with networks today is a couple issues that teams have to face, and one is really the influence of the internet. I myself like to go on vacations where I just completely unplug, don't check in at all on the internet, and this frustrates people. But I have learned years ago just how much of an impact the ability to just go on Google or chat with people on Facebook really limits your thought process quite a bit. Now, when it comes to teams, what I've also seen is that that lack of deep thought uh, is influencing how teams solve problems. Often they'll just go on the internet. And a good example is a team was asked to come up with a recommendation engine. So they went on the internet, found something on Google on the first page, and said, "This is the best one." I'd never even heard of the project on Apache. And having worked on recommenders for several years, more than that team, I was quite suspect. Went and looked at the project and realized nobody's even talked on it or touched it in 6 months. But it was coming up on the first page results on Google when you looked up best recommender system. It came up, and they wrongfully assumed that was actually true because they lacked the thought, the depth of thought to really go out there and examine what they were looking at. And that's a real problem for teams. And the decision makers need to be able to be aware that this is happening when their teams are going out there and coming up with solutions. They really need to challenge their teams to think and do real deep thinking, not this surface level stuff that is so prevalent today. Uh, but the thing is, with the networks being as they are today, you have to actively make sure your teams are thinking at that deep thought level. Otherwise, the nature of the networks today are going to run prevalent, and you'll find out usually the hard way that something was missed because deep thought was not taking place because the network dictated that it shouldn't. Or somebody who's very persuasive but lacks true knowledge is going to be influencing decision making process that at the end of the day proves to be fatal to the team and creates some rather expensive problems down the road. Within networks and data science teams, as well as executive sponsors, we all too often see something called the Diderot effect. Diderot was a French aristocrat who had gotten a new robe that he fell in love with, and in comparison, he felt that all his other possessions looked like junk. So he went on a shopping spree, buying all new items to match the greatness of his new robe. This, of course, led to a financial crisis where he was put in severe debt, and upon reflection, realized that he had gone from being the master of his old robe to the slave of his new robe. Uh, the Diderot effect is something that you often see when companies are getting into the whole, uh, really anything new when it comes to technology. Data science in a lot of teams is kind of the shiny object right now, and people spend an exorbitant amount of money on these teams. It's no different than shopping. So on this slide here for Diderot effect, I have a picture of an IKEA catalog. And I have this up here as a good example because we all go shopping. If you go to an IKEA store, you often see these nice little setups where they'll show you what a room looks like if you had all these different products, of course, that IKEA sells. and it's all set up nice. So you may go in there looking for just a table, but then all of a sudden you like, oh well, it looks great with these chairs and that lamp and well that bookshelf too. I need that as well. Before you know it, something that should have cost you maybe $100, now you've walked out with $1,000 worth of new stuff. We've all fallen for that at one point in our lives as a consumer. In a business, it's something that we often fall for, but nobody ever wants to discuss because that is often seen as a sign of weakness. But it happens a lot. I've seen teams go through millions and millions of dollars. A good example was one where I had built and put into production a recommendation system that cost about $3 million, and this is at a Fortune 100 company. And this was building from scratch. We had nothing, not even servers, not even team members. So we went out, hired people, bought everything, $3 million. One of our competitors saw what we had done and saw the success we had, so they decided they were going to do the same thing. 10 months later, $8 million later, they announced that they had completed their prototype of their recommendation engine. Well, by then, my team had built a couple dozen recommenders and was making money hand over fist. In fact, we never even got close to spending half of what that team did just to make one prototype. But they had fallen into the Diderot effect because, as I heard later on, they had to get all new servers that were specialized, but then it wasn't fast enough, so they went to solid state drives in their servers, and they needed cloud implementation as well and the latest gadgets. And they needed a spot in Silicon Valley because they needed to be in the heart of it all. And that's the Diderot effect. Because at the end of the day, they spent all this money and it took the company years to recoup the costs, whereas for me, it just took months. Don't fall into the Diderot effect. This space is so prevalent with that. And it's all because a lot of times the people in our networks that are influence us are really talking from a position of persuasion, not a position of experience. And you really have to ask people, well, what experience do you really have building things and being responsible for the P&L? And if they say, well, I was a coder or I was a data scientist, you got to ask them, well, were you responsible for the P&L? Was your neck on the line if money was not made? And if they say no, don't listen to them. You got to go talk to the person who's actually had their neck on the line and was responsible for actually making money. They're the ones that can tell you what really worked and what didn't. Otherwise, you're just talking to somebody who experimented and thinks that what they did was great. But you're going to find that persuasive person is quite prevalent today, and that's because of the time period we live in. In an atemporal time period, everything is fluid, and we have access to all information instantaneously, instead of formatted as stories like we have in the past. Many people today are still using old methods to try to understand data, and what is actually needed are new methods and narratives, which have yet to be truly formed. This is one of the reasons why I like to say that right now, at least in the world of analytics, we are living in a period of atemporality. To help explain what is atemporality, I like to talk about the example of the old Soviet Union. I have many friends who grew up in the old Soviet Union who have now emigrated to the US. They talk about how they grew up in a communist time period where the rules and the truths were defined to fit the norms of which they grew up in. Then the Soviet Union collapsed and they were a part of Latvia, Russia, Ukraine. Using Russia as an example here, since it's the largest country of the old Soviet Union, people were still trying to use the old methods that they knew were tried and true in the Soviet Union. But throughout the 90s, that was failing as we saw lots of poverty and the inability to pay the bills. But you also saw a lot of fluctuations in terms of what should the new reality be. Obviously, you can't go back to the old ways because people had decided that they did not want to go back. And you had some people talking about bringing back the old Tsarist monarchy. But again, that too was something that they did not want to go back to because that was no longer representative of who they were. They couldn't exactly go towards Western democracy or Western socialism as practiced in Western Europe because, again, that also was not something that represented who they were. The 90s was a period where the Russians had to figure out what does it mean to be Russian in a new world. Along came Putin, and whether you like his policies or not, what Putin did was help to stabilize Russia and give it a new identity, a new set of truths and rules in which everybody could work off of. For the most part, it has helped the average Russian. Obviously, you can find examples where it hasn't, but for the majority, it has made their life better than it was in the 90s. They're now out of what we would call an atemporal time period, which is a period marked by lots of fluidity. There's an abundance of chaos, an abundance of information and various viewpoints, all competing for what should be the new truth and the new normal. In a lot of ways, right now, that is the space that data science, big data, and a lot of the analytical fields occupy right now. For the most part, we're using a lot of old methods that have worked quite well for some of the teams. Many companies put data science in IT because they say, well, it's coding. And it doesn't really work out so well because it's not really a developer or an engineer type role, even though those positions may be on the team. Others will put it in an analytics team, which often removes them from a lot of the business users as well as the IT players on their team. And again, others will put it under strategy, which for the most part that makes a lot of sense because the person who runs the team should typically have a very strategic role. But that also has its own set of issues too. This new norm is no longer well, there isn't a new norm, and the mooring that kept everybody happy and productive in old systems is no longer there. So a lot of teams are having to choose between the past and the present methods and finding that neither one's really working for them all that well. And this is something that we're going to see work itself out probably over the next 5 to maybe even 10 years as new norms come into play because there's a lot of competing ideas out there. Of course, I have some of my own where, that's for a whole different discussion. But we have to recognize that an atemporal time period is happening. And when I'm talking to senior leadership, it's often my role to make them aware of this and say, hey, yeah, things are changing. We're not going to create something that's going to be set in stone. We have to allow for some fluidity and adaptability to take place as we're building our practices out. So, how do we transition through an atemporal time period without losing our way uh, and trying to balance with current action to action transition with a more aspect to aspect transition? I think one of the great ways to illustrate and sort of explain what is aspect to aspect versus action to action is looking at things like anime. So the image I have on this slide is a screenshot from the live action movie Ghost in the Shell. And if you go back and look at the original works from which it is taking its inspiration from, which is the 1995 original Ghost in the Shell anime, you'll see something that's very prevalent in Asian cultures, which is called aspect to aspect transition. That is really the exploration of space devoid of action or time. And I really like this concept because I have found it helps data science teams work quite well. Whereas here in the West, we're very focused on action to action. Everybody wants to know what am I doing, when am I doing it, and why am I doing it. That's a very action to action type of mindset. And that is very important to have that, but it's also very important to couple it with the exploration of space. And by space, I mean your environment. to really understand how is your environment impacting your ability to do your work. The environment often influences our own decision making. We like to believe that we create our environments to suit us, but we do not create our environments alone. It's usually a group effort. So, what are those forces and stimuli working upon you that are impacting you that you may not know? Or how is the data that you're collecting, how is the fact that it was structured a certain way, how is that influencing the work you're doing? I used to work with a really good data scientist a few years ago, and he always spent the time, about a month, learning a new data set. And he said he was just exploring the data set just to see what it's like. And once he took the time to do that, he really understood the data in a way that others who don't take that effort and time really never could understand. And I still see this today. Really good data scientists who do the work of delving into the data, they just take the time to explore it. And that's an aspect to aspect transition concept. Being there over getting there is one of the philosophies of aspect to aspect. And within your network, I find it's very important to keep looking at things like that. You know, humanity creates space, yet our spaces all create our identity. And again, going back to Ghost in the Shell, you see this quite well. If you haven't seen the original 1995 anime, I highly recommend you go out and watch it because there is a 3 minute scene right in the middle of the movie, and or Ghost in the Shell 2 has the same concept, where you see people moving in the city and space, almost like packets of data being moved around in a network. In a lot of ways, the believed utopias or dystopias of cyberpunk are starting to show themselves in our modern data rich environments. Our teams are often asked to focus on action. They do not really understand this lack of understanding of the environment is a symptom of their own lack of understanding of space in which they occupy. More exploration of space is something that leads to success. I used to comment on a reflection of some teams. They were often organized much like the technology stacks that they use, such as distributed or relational based databases. They were reflecting their environment, or was the environment reflecting them? It's something I always like to explore when meeting different teams. Who's really influencing whom here? More often than not, it was the team reflecting the environment. That's why a clear understanding of the space that a team works in is critically vital. Not only that, but a clear understanding of the environment influencers. We never create our environments on our own, or what are the outside influencers on our own environment who subsequently influence us is a topic of discussion that's rarely seen today in most analytical teams, but one that could give them great insight to why they are doing what they do. Something that I think is very important is if you're buying products from a vendor, really know who that vendor is. What is their philosophy on the development of the products that they're putting out there for you to use? If you don't really understand that, then you're really creating blind. You don't know what influential pressures are dictating your responses because all these products out there are curated in some way and they limit us in various aspects and ways to do our job. If we don't have a true understanding of that, we're making decisions without truly understanding what are the variables that get us to the answers we believe that we've come up with. When it comes to data science work, the ability to control one space is very important, as we just went over in the last slide. And that's why I'm a firm believer in heterotopia environments. All too often in the space of innovation, which is where data science tends to gravitate towards, you see a lot of people wanting to create what they determine to be a utopia-like environment where everything's going to be set up just perfect as they deem fit. But the problem with utopias is one person's utopia is going to be someone else's dystopia. And that is a real problem when it comes to data science work because data science is truly about discovery. And innovation and creativity go hand in hand with that. Yet often the space is most often squashed by organizations because of this belief in a utopia like environment. And yes, when it comes to production, having a standard environment is very important, very critical. But what I'm talking about here is having an environment for exploration and discovery, test environments. You don't need to have a single environment that follows all the norms. A heterotopia environment is really something that I have found creates great success and results. It creates a dynamic space of layers and meanings. It's a space for the marginalized to go and do their work. The norms are suspended. The the way the systems are designed to fit the problem needing to be solved. This is where heterotopias really come into their play is that discovery world. This singular view that many teams go for is what limits the ability for teams to have success. Heterotopias take that out of play. When you have a heterotopia environment, essentially the team can determine how to set up a testbed environment based off of what the actual situation is, not the limitations of the test environment. Now, I've done this at several companies where we set up heterotopia test environments and we were able to quickly figure out proof of life on a lot of ideas and then move forward to a production environment where things were standardized at that point in time. I find that having heterotopia test environments is a real winner. The cost tends not to be that high, particularly if you're using open source tools, but the benefits can be quite rewarding. Because remember, at this point in time, you're not really trying to test to see if something will work in production. You're just testing to see, do I even have a case here? That's why I call it proof of life. You're not even at proof of concept yet. You're just trying to see, is there even something here to go even further? So allowing teams to spin up and shut down different environments is something that really will help out in the long run. And finally, we get to identity. All things change in a dynamic environment, including self. The problem is that a lot of data scientists and other players within the space are having a hard time dealing with the chaos and overabundance of information, as well as the viewpoints, and have a difficult time with any discussion at all when it comes to figuring out how do you make data science work. Identity and space are now merging. The data scientist is often defined by the space he or she works in. An example is oftentimes you'll see, you have to know Python or R or Scala, and that defines a lot of who the data scientist is. Or, do they work on clickstream data? Do they work in distributed environments? That's defining the data scientist in a lot of ways. Space like identity are constructed. Our abilities are limited by the space in which it is produced. That can really be a hindrance in a lot of ways for teams to do their work because if they're put in a box in a lot of ways, they may be limited in their ability to help the organization just by the box being prematurely defined. So, how to identify identity was and is still an important question for any data science team. You can't define it based off of the old terms like stats and coding, but a new definition is still being defined. That's where heterotopias help do the exploration of the space as well as refine the identity. And I do think that it's important to continue to define what is a data scientist? The coding and stats alone is no longer cutting it. There's data visualization, there's the social sciences aspects of it. There's also the leadership of the team aspect, which is more of a translator role than anything else. All these roles are starting to come into play, and identity of the players on the teams are changing, and really understanding who does what is important. You're not going to find that unicorn or purple squirrel. They just don't exist. If they do exist, they're not going to come work for you for 120K a year. That's just a fact. So understand that the identity of the different team players is very critical to success of your team. The wrong identities is going to create friction, and that friction is just going to slow work down. And now to wrap up the presentation with just a few more slides here. Here are some slides that I like to use from taking these concepts and putting it in more of a practical framework. This is actually a slide that I've used in the past to talk about how would you structure your discipline around data science. As you can see, the business need and strategy is at the top, followed by governance. Then you've got more of your tactical management of the project. This has worked quite well, particularly in the flow of information, which I think is very vital. But then you also have to move on to something called data philosophy. This is taking data and actually making it into something useful. This is an area where a lot of companies tend to fail. You'll hear people say, well, just let the data speak for itself. Data on its own, not very useful. You really have to convert it into information, and information is really that first step where it becomes something useful. And then you have to transfer it into knowledge where people can really gain experience and value out of that, and then collective wisdom so that the organization as a whole can benefit from what you have. And this is a very complex process that a lot of people gloss over and don't understand. So this is actually something that I have my teams try to understand, because this is very vital to getting your practice off the ground and being successful. Without an understanding of this pyramid, you're pretty much guaranteed to fail. And then finally, the hiring process. How do you apply these concepts that I just talked about? So, like, sell your mission, your passion, and why it matters. That's aspect to aspect. Make the most of the heterotopias. So, if you're hiring somebody, talk about the various test environments that they can play in or build up. Because oftentimes the people that gravitate towards these roles, that is something that's very important to them. Promote the ability to define and craft the role and grow with the company. My last three teams that I've built, I created my role for me. And a lot of times the people that come on board, they're also customizing the role for them as well. And that's very important to helping them define who their identity will be within the team. And then you want to have facilitate personal development. And that's atemporality. Like I said, we're in a period of flux. You need to allow people to grow and continue to have their skill sets improved. And that's just not good for the individual, that's good for the organization as well, because we do have an environment in which things are changing. And I've lectured at universities where I've told them, if you're not constantly learning, you're pretty much obsolete in 3 years at the most in this field. As an organization, you want to encourage that personal growth and development, because without it, your data scientist team will become obsolete rather quickly. And then for networks, offer incentives, money, prestige, flex work hours, because you're going to be dealing with the community. And this is something that I find a lot of companies don't understand. Data science is a small community when you really think about it. There are a lot of people calling themselves data scientists or working in the field, but there's very few that are truly defining the industry. So you want to make sure that you're recruiting the ones that are really pushing the envelope and creating real change versus those that just are grabbing the title. And that means you're going to have to offer them something that's worth it. And yes, money is important. You shouldn't be skimping out. You can get the inexperienced people at a lower price, but those that are in the market who have done this, been there, they're going to cost you. And it usually pays for itself, because I've seen companies where they go somewhere somewhat cheaper and those projects fail because the experienced person is no longer there to really drive things. And there are other things like flex work hours that people are interested in, or the ability to go to conferences and talk to other people who know what they're doing. But also don't forget that cool work that's fun and motivating is something that really helps as well. And then once somebody's in there and they really get a good feel for your company and they can go out and talk about it, your ability to network across the network will really pay off. So that's my presentation that I gave at FarCon. You can follow me on Twitter or email me, or if you like, just look me up on LinkedIn. You can find me on most of the major platforms. If you got any comments, feel free to contact me or comment here. And thank you.